That is actually a very, very good question because it doesn't have a clear answer.
We're going into my psychology into this podcast and the way that I think a bit too much.
The business of banking will survive. Who the people are, who the players are, will be differing, changing over time.
Hello and welcome to Any Further Questions, a brand new podcast from Gresham College. My name is Richard Taverner and I am your host. This is a podcast where we invite one of our speakers on to go a little bit further on one of their recent talks. Today I am joined by our current Mercer School Memorial Professor of Business, Raghavendra Rau. Raghu, welcome. How are you?
Fine. Thank you very much for inviting me, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
You were appointed in 2022, and you're also the Sir Evelyn de Rothschild Professor of Finance at Cambridge Judge Business School. You specifically look at market efficiency, and the title of your first series of talks for Gresham is The Tech Revolution in Finance. And today we're going to be talking about a lecture you gave in October called Bypassing Banks Using Tech. And it's interesting that you specialise in market efficiency, and we're going to be talking about how traditional banks have not been very efficient in their own market. Can I start by first asking you to explain in your own words what your Gresham series is about and why you chose it?
Well, the Gresham series last year was pretty much about how the stable, almost static world of banking and finance, which has lasted almost unchanged for over 1,000 years, has suddenly been shaken up in the last 10 years by events we read about in the papers almost every day. For example, in the last couple of months, AI, especially large language models, have suddenly become very prominent. Even a year ago, I would not have put that in my lectures because it didn't, they didn't exist. So what's been happening the last 10 years is that technology has taken a dramatic role in reshaping the world as we know it, starting with, the invention of the first smartphone back in the early 2000s. The iPhone, for example, came out in 2007. And all of this put computing technology to broad, widespread use among the masses. So everybody, almost in my world, everybody I know has a smartphone. And so that capacity to have a very powerful computing device with you, does it have the ability to shake up the world of finance? And that's what I was trying to explore in this lecture. And I think would have been fascinating for the audience because all of us are familiar with banking. Many of us have had bank accounts which we have stayed for a very, very long period of time. How is that world changing? How are people dealing with finance?
Bypassing banks using tech, your lecture specifically focused on traditional banks, and I think after watching your lecture, the journey that banks have had from where they first started in being a trustworthy place to keep your money, from where they are now to they're losing the race, essentially. There are FinTech companies, they're called, tech companies that essentially are banks that are taking customers away from the traditional banks. Could I ask you a bit about when this first started and why this is happening?
In my lecture series, I talk about three different technologies that actually occurred around the financial crisis back in 2008. And so the problem is with the financial crisis, it tends to overshadow everything else that happened around that time. But if you think of all the technological innovations that came to fruition around that time, for example, social networks, Facebook, smartphones, the iPhone, crypto, the introduction of blockchain technology, all of these things came within less than 2 or 3 years of each other. And so it was a kind of period of time which was a hotbed of innovation, but we didn't pay that much attention to that hotbed simply because of the fact that the financial crisis was so big, it overshadowed everything else. So when we think of the end of the 2000s, we think only of the financial crisis. But that's when I think the technological revolution also started around the same time. And in a way, they fed off each other because the financial crisis lowered people's trust in banks and made them open to trying other forms of technology, such as, for example, DeFi or crypto or other things like that. Without the financial crisis, it might have been more difficult for people to shift away. So it was both a kind of force for disruption, as well as the ability, the technology to actually do the disruption. They had to occur simultaneously.
And the stats don't lie. I read an article recently which basically outlined average global banking return on equity. So this is the measure of profitability in relation to equity. And prior to the 2008 crisis, this was set at 15%. In 2020, it was 6%, 2021, 9%. And in 2030, it's projected to fall below 7.2%. We're seeing that banks are losing their profitability because other players are entering the market. Since 2015, roughly 200 digital banks have been launched, and as of September 2022, there are at least 274 fintech companies with a unicorn valuation of more than 1 billion. How are they disrupting the market, and what exactly are these new fintech companies doing in order to entice people away from traditional banks?
There are actually three types of companies which are disrupting the market right now. One are what I would call neobanks. So, these are like banks. These are like digital banks. Examples in the UK include Tandem, Monzo, companies like that. There are fintech companies which take one or two of the functions of the banks, but they don't replicate the whole bank. So they would offer just loans, for example, SoFi in America. They might offer just payment systems like M-Pesa in Kenya, and things like that. And finally, there are the big tech companies. Those are the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks of the world. These are companies that basically say, okay, we will give you a wallet, for example, to spend. If you have an Apple phone, many people just use an Apple wallet. Google similarly has a Google wallet. And the whole point is they get access to data on your actual purchases, which they can then use to sell you additional stuff. So the business models of these three are different. The first one, the neobanks are basically saying, look, we don't have to deal with the legacy infrastructure of the old banks. So if you think about a big bank on Main Street today, Barclays, Santander, companies like that, they have been around for quite some time. So what they do also have is an enormous code base written in languages like COBOL, which were actually written in the 1970s. COBOL was actually my first language. I think I mentioned this in my lecture. But nobody writes in COBOL anymore. And so if you want to maintain those things, you have to find some COBOL programmer who's also an expert in the new technology and try to marry these systems together. That's incredibly, incredibly expensive, and it's incredibly slow, right, for the legacy banks. The new banks say, look, we're going to write our systems using, without using COBOL or the older technologies. We're online only, so we'd can hire fewer people. Our productivity is much higher, and we'll offer exactly the same service as the regular bank. So that's their USP. That's their selling model. The other group of guys, the second group of guys, the fintech companies, are picking off particular parts of the banking infrastructure. They're saying, you know what, the bank makes loans, but I can raise money, like a peer-to-peer lender. I can raise money from individuals and directly channel them to people who want loans. I don't have to go to a bank. And they say we can do this cheaper than the bank can, again, because they don't have a legacy infrastructure. But they're not competing along every dimension. They don't, for example, all take deposits. They may just provide insurance. They may just provide, as I said, loans. They may provide something else. But those are tiny parts of the business. And the big tech companies say, well, the financial service is not really a big part of our business model. What we want is your data. Because the data we can then sell to advertisers, we can then sell to actually sell you things. So in other words, their business model is, I'm going to undercut the banks on whatever they're doing and make money in the process by using your data for something else. So you have three different types of companies all attacking banks in different directions.
What's interesting is that the trust element to it is that I would imagine that people trust legacy banks, traditional banks more because they've been around more and they've proven that they've worked in the past. What's interesting is the psychology of customers trusting these new tech companies with their money, which is important because if something were to go wrong, if they were to be hacked especially in this new day and age when that's a real possibility, I find it interesting that people are putting their trust in these new tech companies and moving away from legacy banking. Do you agree? Do you find that interesting?
That is interesting, but there are two things which you have to remember. Number one is, if you think of the first group of guys who are competitors to the old legacy banks, they are the neobanks. They are banks. That means they're regulated exactly the same as the other banks. Now, I would argue that it's not so much I'm trusting Barclays because Barclays has been around forever, so I trust it. I'm actually only trusting Barclays because the government guarantees that if something happens to Barclays, I get my money back. In the UK, it's up to £85,000. And especially in the US, for example, a lot of the small regional banks have been losing deposits because people say, wait a minute, you're a small bank. My deposits only guaranteed up to $250,000 in America. What happens if I have more than that? I would rather go to a big bank over there. So, it's the only thing. The reason I trust a big bank is because it's too big to fail. The government will bail you out if something goes wrong. The small banks are saying, the neobanks are saying, well, we are giving you the same level of protection from the government. So almost the only thing is not so much trust. I would probably say inertia, or if we put this in a very, controversial way, I would probably say laziness. Right, so people are like, okay, I've got all my direct deposits in the legacy banks. I've got all this stuff. It's going to take me time and effort to shift it over. Am I really going to do that for a couple of £100, right? The thing you have to remember is there's a second big disruption happening right now, which I didn't talk about in my lectures because it hadn't happened then, but that's because the environment has changed dramatically since 2008. 2008, financial crisis, central banks everywhere around the world dropped interest rates almost to zero. For a while, we were getting negative interest rates in parts of Europe. Now, interest rates have shot through the roof in the last 1 year, causing a lot of bank failures. For example, Silicon Valley Bank in America, things like that. But the interest rate right now is 5% in the UK, about slightly higher in America, but inflation is even higher. Trusting the legacy banks are good. It would have been okay, I guess, between 2008 2022, because you're not getting much elsewhere. But today, if you leave your money with a legacy bank, you're leaving 8% money on the table.
As you reminded me before we started recording, I'm with a legacy bank, as it's called, Natwest. And as you said, me leaving my money in Natwest and not moving, I'm essentially losing 8% a year. Is that correct?
That's inflation. Because
inflation,
prices are going up by the day.
Yeah.
You won't get it all back because even the best banks today in the UK are offering between 4.5 and 5%. So you're still losing money, but you're not losing as much money as you would have with NatWest. I think the government is making noises about trying to persuade the big banks to offer higher rates to let it pass through. But the banks are just sitting pretty because they know, precisely because of people like you, that they can afford to relax a little bit.
And what my behaviour is described as is behavioural bias, and that is one of the three problems that you talk about in your lecture in dealing with three types of information: imperfect, asymmetric, and behavioural biases. I did tell you, I think, the reason why I've stayed with NatWest and not moved yet is, I have to admit, I do trust NatWest more so than I do trust these new fintech companies. But I think, having talked to you today, I might have to have another think about it. We'll go into the three types of information a bit later on in the podcast, but I just wanted to ask you, how easy is it to set up a new bank or set up a tech company and to entice people to bank with you and not with a legacy bank?
That is actually a very, very good question because it doesn't have a clear answer. So as I said again, if you look at those three categories of companies, setting up a new bank with a banking license is just as difficult as it was in the old days. Which is, you have to deal with the government. And that means you have to satisfy the Financial Conduct Authority here in the UK. You have to satisfy the FDIC in America. You have to satisfy a whole bunch of regulatory institutions that you are indeed capable of being a bank, which means that you have to have anti-money laundering rules in place, KYC. They have to make sure that your customers are safe. You have to provide enormous amounts of information. So that is tough. But if you do it because you don't have the costs of maintaining the banks, it's actually quite lucrative for these guys. However, by the way, some banks are solving that problem. Some fintech companies are solving the problem by buying existing banks, right? So they already come with a banking license attached. So once you have that banking license, you can just use that to continue banking under the same license. The fintech companies are not doing that. The fintech companies are kind of saying, look, I'm not a whole bank. I'm not offering you everything a bank does. I'm offering you only one small part of it. I'm offering you just the insurance company part of it. I'm just offering you something. So my regulatory concerns are much smaller than I would have with a regular bank. So it's easier to break in there. The problem, of course, with a peer-to-peer lending platform, for example, is the deposits are not as stable as they would be for a bank. So if you're lending money to a group of people but taking deposits from some other group of people, the essence of a bank, you can't do it that easily with a P2P company because it's not regulated like a bank. So you cannot have that stability of deposits to offer the loans on the other side. So companies like Zopa, which used to be a peer-to-peer lending platform, have now become banks because they said, look, we'd rather get the money, stable money, which you can then make loans on. But again, they don't take deposits in the sense of easy access accounts, credit card, debit card, stuff like that. They just say fixed rate accounts. So you give your money to Zopa, they'll give you a fixed rate for a year, and then they will take the money and lend it out somewhere else. So the idea is, can I break into a small part of the market? That's what these second group of companies are doing. And of course, the big tech companies, for them, this is a drop in the bucket, right? I mean, if you think about a company like, Google, it could buy any of these banks in a shot. It just doesn't choose to do so because it's not interested in them. It's not interested in the business of moving money. It's interested in the data.
That's what my next question was going to be. Could a company like Amazon, like Google, decide to move into this space?
Actually, they have. For example, Apple in America did launch a debit card in association with Goldman Sachs. It was actually oddly enough, their marketing was, it is a very cool, sleek-looking card with no name, nothing on it, just a card. Right, and that's the idea. It's like designed by Apple, but at the end of the day, it's still just a card, right? So, but the bank actually providing the funds was sitting behind Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs would do all the banking stuff. These guys would cream off the data, and that's all they were interested in. And so, later on, they got so much data, they kind of figured, okay, let's jump to the next step. They actually started offering loans to people, and they told Goldman, we don't need you anymore. Right, so Goldman had given them all the banking expertise in a way, and now Apple says we can do this stuff without having to involve you. Right? I think Amazon does the same thing. Amazon offers a whole bunch of small business loans to people who are, have merchants or merchants on Amazon, because Amazon knows every bit of data on what you're selling through them. It knows what you are, it knows how much you're selling, it knows when you're selling it, it knows how long the shipments take to get to their customers, it knows how happy the customers are. There's a much better sense of whether you're a good merchant than a bank ever would.
That's the point, isn't it? It's the data and the infrastructure.
Correct.
These companies have data, and that's incredibly important in today's culture and how we live. And that's possibly why these fintech companies and these larger companies are moving so far ahead. What would you say? Do you think it's bound to happen where the traditional legacy banks catch up? Are they going to catch up soon? Or is this problem that we're seeing going to continue for the foreseeable future?
That's another excellent question. It's very difficult to predict this because the big banks, they have the advantage that, they've been around so long, they know all the regulators, they know the people they have to deal with, and the banks are familiar, the regulators are familiar with their systems. So I can, as a regulator, I could go to Barclays or Santander and say, okay, I know whom I'm talking to, I know what they do, and so it's kind of like almost like an old boys network, right? And so they have been coasting somewhat on their laurels. To give you an example, I have an account with Barclays, And for some reason, I switched my money away from one of these banks to one of the new banks, Tandem, as it happened. And the bank froze my account right away. It said, oh, this is fraud. Why are you sending money to these guys? What are they offering that we are not offering? I had to spend an hour on the phone trying to persuade them that it's my money. I was doing this for a legitimate reason, and you're not offering me the same interest rate that they are, so I want to move my money. So after an hour talking at different times during the day, eventually they restored access to my own account, but they had frozen my app. And it's been now 3 weeks, and my app is still not working.
Wow, okay.
And so, they are coasting on their past glories. How much they can keep coasting on their past glories depends a lot on the inertia of customers.
And why don't they invest in these new companies? Why don't it go the other way? So you mentioned earlier in the podcast that fintech companies are buying legacy banks or investing in legacy banks. Why doesn't it go the other way? Why don't we see
big banks?
We may see, yeah.
Actually, that is actually goes right back to the legacy costs.
Okay.
Because the legacy costs, if you think about the big banks, not just the infrastructure, it's also the people. Right? So imagine yourself as a manager working for Natwest. So you've been there for 20 years, right? You haven't needed to deal with all this technology. And so you come in, and then every day you're doing the same thing. You're dealing with the same regulators. Everything's happening exactly the way it's been happening for 20 years. Now suddenly NatWest senior management says, okay, we're going to buy this new company and use their technology in place of your technology. What are you going to do? You're going to slow walk this stuff, right? You're going to say, all right, but it's going to disrupt our culture. You're going to be annoyed that some 20-year-old is coming in here who is familiar with the new technology and trying to take your job away from you. So you won't give him the information that he asked for. You will try your best to sabotage him if possible. And so a lot of the old banks are trying to get around this problem by having partnerships with the new banks. So they sort of funnel money through them, but they don't actually own them, or they buy them but keep them in a separate building from everybody else. That's the problem. How do you integrate a new technology to this already massive code base of technology you have, and the people? So the people are the big problem in many of the older banks.
I think we should move on to it now then. In your lecture, you talked about dealing with three types of information: imperfect, asymmetric, and behavioural biases, which we touched upon earlier. Could you just talk a bit more about imperfect, asymmetric, and behavioural biases, and how does this relate to the conversation we're having?
Okay. The easy way to think about it is very straightforward. I mean, the imperfect information is just that I don't have enough information to deal with something, right? I need more information to handle this. And that's where I was talking about big data. So the idea is the more data you collect on something, the more information you have in order to analyze something. However, the problem is the amount of data available to us vastly exceeds the capacity to process it. So we need other systems like artificial intelligence to try to handle that deluge of data, to extract patterns from that data. The second problem of asymmetric information is there's always one side of the transaction that has more information than the other side. So, for example, if you are buying a jacket in a farmer's market, and you ask the seller, "How good is your jacket?" This jacket seller, I guarantee, will always say it's wonderful, right? It's a perfect jacket, even though sometimes he's lying to you. That's the concept of asymmetric information. For a bank or a financial institution in general, this is huge. Take a bank, right? The banker, if he asks you, why are you borrowing money? He says, I want to build a house. Will you pay back the money? Of course I'm planning to pay back the money, right? Nobody's ever going to say, I'm going to take your money and run. So the bank has to try to get that information from you. Are you really going to pay back that money? So that's the asymmetric information problem, right? And of course, the behavioral bias problem, one of them which you already illustrated, Richard, is that inertia, right? People tend to stay too long with suboptimal solutions. People tend to hang on to losers rather than selling their losers and buying the winners, right? So we are all subject to behavioral biases all the time, but we don't necessarily recognize it. So what I also talk about is how big tech companies, the companies that are used to handling your data, can help you. That is, they can highlight particular biases for you and say, you're subject to this bias, don't do it. or they can take advantage of the biases by selling you things precisely when you're most vulnerable to those kind of entreaties.
GovCoins is something you mentioned in the lecture as well. Now, this is cryptocurrency issued by governments and backed by central banks. Could you tell me a bit about GovCoins? You gave the lecture in October. Has there been any movement on this? I did some research on GovCoins, and the articles I found were 2021, 2022, so they were quite dated. And I wondered if there was a reason for that.
There's been one big event which has just happened in the last year. That is the change in, essentially it was COVID, right? During COVID, government supported most of the people in America, in the UK, in Europe. And so we ended up, but we couldn't actually spend that money on anything because there were no opportunities to eat out. There were no, even in spite of, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, but a lot of people didn't take advantage of that. But so a lot of people ended up with money which they hadn't used during the pandemic. So in a way, it was a sort of what they call revenge spending coming out of the pandemic. Everybody started spending like crazy, which drove prices up dramatically. First, because of supply chain constraints, people couldn't, the manufacturers couldn't ship enough product to the consumers fast enough to prevent prices from going up. And then because of the Ukraine war, which caused, constrictions in energy supply and so on. So what happened was inflation dramatically took off last year, and central bankers have been trying to clamp down on it by raising interest rates aggressively. Now, this is a brand new phenomenon. But because of this phenomenon, when I say it's a brand new phenomenon, it's a brand new phenomenon for many people who have only come of age in the 20s, right? Because for those of us who were alive in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, myself included, inflation is not really something which we are unfamiliar with. It's the last 30 years which has an era of very low interest rates that are uncommon for us. So what's happened with that is, because of that massive change in that interest rate environment, a lot of alternative investments have suddenly dropped. And the reason, when you mention GovCoins, basically these are government-backed stable coins, sort of digital currencies. Governments were thinking about introducing it mainly because of crypto. They basically said, look, cryptocurrencies are alternatives to central bank fiat currencies. We can't control the crypto. We need to have something we can control. And so there was this impetus about 2017, 2018 to 2019, but more and more governments saying we need to introduce digital currencies just to offer an alternative to common people that they don't invest in crypto, which we do not control. But then COVID, and now at high interest rate inflation, it's almost a crypto winter. You saw prices collapse in the crypto market. You saw a huge number of scandals showing up, FTX, Celsius Bank, Luna, all these things were happening. And so the government's kind of said, well, now we can afford to take our time. It is a complicated problem, right? Because at the end, introducing a stable coin means you have to make decisions about whether you're going to bypass the banks or not. Because regardless of what I said earlier, banks do serve a purpose. They do create money. They transferring when you deposit your money in a bank, the bank lends it out to somebody else. That person deposits their money in a bank, and so on. The process keeps continuing. So every initial dollar you deposit ends up with much more than $1 in terms of the total spending power they have. So if you want to get rid of a bank altogether by offering direct money to the public, I would rather put my money in the Bank of England than I would in Barclays, right? If I have a choice, especially if I can get government interest rates, which are much higher than what Barclays is offering. But the government wants to keep the banks alive. So drop in the interest in crypto, plus the high interest rate environment right now, both together have sort of pet the government, okay, we can take our time. We don't have to force this, So most GovCoins or stable coins really haven't been pushed out with great extent by the governments.
The volatility of cryptocurrency is insane. I've seen the value of cryptocurrency that I've invested in jump up and down on a day-to-day basis. You don't see that. If you put your money into a traditional legacy bank, you don't see that.
Right.
So that might be another thing to it, is that the reason why traditional banks, legacy banks, are still being trusted is the fact that putting your money out into the ether, into the tech space, into AI, into cryptocurrency, putting your money out into there, something could happen which you can't foresee.
Mm-hmm.
Before we started the podcast, you mentioned ChatGPT,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned AI, and you mentioned AI in your lecture as well. And that brings me on to that, thinking about something we can't see, something we can't envisage, something we can't accurately predict what's going to happen.
Correct.
How is that going to change the way that we bank in the future with the introduction of AI and with the introduction of those kinds of elements?
Well, AI is somewhat of a misnomer. It's not really intelligent in the way we think of intelligence. It's a cool term, but it actually literally applied statistics. What these are very advanced pattern matching generators. So they look for patterns in high dimensional complex data, and they basically extrapolate on the basis of those patterns to come up with a new pattern. So to give you an example, in 2023, this year, we had in February and March the release of OpenAI's, ChatGPT type models. I use it every day. I can't imagine going even a single day without using it now. There are over 100 million users who signed up to OpenAI in literally over the space of a month. And so the idea here is these things help in reducing the burden of routine tasks which can be easily automated. For example, filling in forms in a bank, right? But there is a person right now, somebody who's being paid to enter your information directly from a conversation or from a form into a database. Now, I can imagine a bank manager sitting in front of you, transcribing has the phone open, transcribes your machine, and transcribes your voice, automatically taken straight into the database by an artificial intelligence program, which then predicts what you're going to do based on that pattern. This may or may not be correct, right? Because they're using large patterns to try to predict individual people, which is not necessarily a good idea. But that's an example of something that has a potential to dramatically change how business works. For example, think about due diligence for a merger or an acquisition. Investment banks earn a ton of money by going to firms and arranging for their merger or an acquisition by another company. But that means you have massive sets of documents with detailed legalese, and to wade through all that takes a ton of time, usually done by an intern. You can put that into a large language model and ask it to extract the summaries of that. You have to be careful because there are things like hallucinations which come up when you ask them to, generate citations. There was a lawyer in America who got into trouble for this because apparently he had generated all his citations for his cases from ChatGPT, and they were all fake. None of those citations were really true.
Oh, okay.
And the judge tried to find the citations. They couldn't. So they asked the lawyer, how did you get those citations? And the lawyer said, well, I got it from ChatGPT. And they said, did you check that these were actually correct? And the lawyer says, yes, I did. I asked ChatGPT whether these were real citations, and ChatGPT assured me that they were real.
Oh, God. It's ridiculous.
So you do have to be careful. So it's sort of like a semi-trained intern. But you are cutting down the sheer number of people required from maybe 10 interns to one intern who's just checking over the output of a particular model. That's a huge productivity jump. Right? And so these are the kind of things which should keep bank managers awake at night. Right? Even the thing about inertia, for example, what you were just talking about, keeping your same account with NatWest. Silicon Valley Bank thought it had something very similar. It thought it had built relationships with their Silicon Valley customers who were young companies which needed, cash. And it thought, they would wine them, it would dine them, it would give them free coffee or whatever, good relationships with all of them. But these were smart people. The moment they saw the bank was in trouble, everybody pulled out the money, including a classic bank run. right? Relationships don't matter if you have $100,000 which you're going to lose.
The race to efficiency for these legacy banks eliminates the human being, I feel. It eliminates that physical person being in a bank. I know in the past when I've had questions over a certain account or what I can do or what I can't do, I've always appreciated another human being there and talking it through them, because phoning up or using a chat, I think Cora is the name of the NatWest chatbot, using that, I feel like I go around in circles.
Yep.
But the reason that they've invested in that technology is so that to make things more efficient, to make things easier, and also to save costs on paying a human being to do it. Personally, for me, I don't think it's going the right way if it keeps doing that. But what it does very well is security. So I had a thought about it on the way here, and I thought it's very difficult for anyone to use any of my cards, my credit card, or steal any money from me without me knowing. I've been abroad and I've forgotten to tell my bank that I've been abroad, and as soon as I've used my card abroad, it's been locked. Straight away it's been frozen, which I think is a very good thing. And that's technology, that's AI doing that and monitoring my patterns and where I've been. Another thing is if you make a payment on my app, or if I were to make a payment for a holiday, for example, it asks me to put my face in the frame of the app now, which it didn't used to do, in order to recognize who I am in order to make that payment. That's something which I think AI has done very well, is in increasing the security. I don't know if you agree with banks.
I have to say I'm not completely on board with some of your statements. I mean, I agree with a large part of it, but let me go back to that first thing about the human being involved, right? I agree with you. It's very nice to have a human being to talk to tell them what it is. But I have to say, number one, it's very difficult to find a human being these days. Banks have shut down a lot of the bank branches, right? So finding a bank branch where someone is willing to talk to you, good luck, right? But even if you do...
But that's not for the lack of someone wanting to do that job.
Fair enough.
That's for the company not...
Choosing to
employ someone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what I also found, and this was my own experience when I was transferring money from one of the old banks to one of the new banks, which I mentioned earlier, is that these guys are reading off the same script that the computers are telling them to do. So this guy would say, "But your account is not of this type." I was like, "No, it was that type back in 2011 when we opened it, but we changed the type in 2015." And he said, "Oh, but my system says it is the original type." I said, "You don't have to ask them." And no, I'm going to have to ask them to verify that they actually shifted. I mean, it's their system. They don't know what their own system does, right? So in a way, most of these people also goes to that idea. What you are coming at, I think, is the idea of human discretion. Does a human being have the ability to override the system of the bank? And in many of these cases, these bank people do not have the ability to override the bank systems because the bank is just so big. Right? So you do not find the case when somebody will say, "Okay, let me handle this. I'll talk to everybody, give you back your solution." It used to happen. Not much more difficult now because the people, when you call them or you use the app, you're probably communicating with someone in a totally different country who just is reading the prompts on his screen. Right? And you might as well have an AI.
And if you have a problem which you've spoken about in the past and you're coming back to it, they don't know what the problem was in the past.
Yeah.
So then there's that barrier too. I can think of an example, a personal example that I had. My father owns a business and we were transferring ownership of management of that business so that they could look at the accounts and operate the accounts. It was an industrial estate and we have tenants on the industrial estate. And we hired a management company to deal with the rents. And in order to do that, we needed to have paperwork, which I needed to print off, and then I needed to sign the paperwork myself, and we needed to send it to the management company to sign it also, and then it needed to go to the bank. This process, I think we did it 6-7 times before it got done, because each time we would send it off to the bank, they would lose the paperwork, they would know where it was, we were told that it wasn't signed properly. To explain that situation to a chatbot or to someone over the phone, it just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So in that, I know it's a very specific example, but for that example, for me, having someone, a human being there, being able to understand that by me just explaining it in 2 minutes was perfect. And I feel like we're moving to a step where we won't get that. And in order to solve complicated problems which, if I just wanted to check what the APR of my credit card was, I'm not going to go into a bank and ask what the APR of my credit card is. If I wanted to change credit cards or change an account, I'm not going to do that. I don't need a human being to do that. I can do that on an app. I know that. But that's 99% of problems. The 1%, which are the ones that are the most frustrating and are most time costly for the consumer, are the ones which I feel like aren't going to be solved efficiently if we move those over. So that's what I was talking about.
You're absolutely right. The part which you're talking about is basically you're saying that 80% of the bank's time is dealing with 20% of the problems.
Yeah.
Right? For a bank's case, usually 99% of the bank's time is 1% of the problems.
Yeah.
The problem is the bank usually doesn't put enough people to deal with that 1% of problems.
No.
So most banks are saying, if I can automate the whole thing, then it's up to you. You're getting increasingly frustrated. But going back, forget the past. When you're talking on a phone, when they transfer you from one person to the other, you have to repeat everything all over again, even though it was just a 1 minute apart. And the guy should have made notes or he should have told the other guy. They don't. They just forward the phone, then you have to go through the whole process again, right? So there's no institutional memory anywhere here. And so the other part about it is actually going back to your old question of what the banks are doing. The other part is that the routine part of the job, so the first part which you talked about was we need a human being to address the complicated stuff, the stuff which is not addressable by an algorithm. I'm totally with you on that. But we don't need as many people as we do now, right? The second thing is the part which is the routine part, which can be automated, is also the most boring part of the job, right? I have to say, the reason I use AI so much is to deal with the admin part of my work at Cambridge. So I get a memo from human resources. I barely understand it. I mean, it's like complicated stuff, and I'm like, whatever. Copy it into ChatGPT. ChatGPT summarizes it for me. I said, give me a response. I tried to feed the response back. They send me a response, probably also generated by ChatGPT. So, they're cutting me and human resources out of the picture. Yeah. I'm happy. I don't have to deal with this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So I think in a way you're saying, yes, I don't have the same number of people working in banks anymore, but maybe I can find something more interesting to do with my life. Right?
The banks are, dealing with money is incredibly important for some people. So I also come from the perspective of, if I've got a problem and I need the bank to solve it, usually the problem is very important to be done as quickly as possible.
Yep.
Because money's involved, and not all problems, but for some problems, if you don't get it solved quickly, then you could be losing money, in an example. So I think, just summarising our conversation, I think what we've established is that legacy traditional banks are still incredibly important. They're important bits of infrastructure, and they're embedded in part of the society of our society of how we deal with money. But as you mentioned in your lecture, they're bottom of the trust tables year after year, so people are losing trust with them. There are lots of banking alternatives. Emerging competition against banks is happening day in, day out, and banks operate on legacy systems that are costly. So what banks are doing are costing money, and what the new FinTech companies are doing are saving money. I just wanted to finish our conversation by asking some questions which we've had from our online audience. We've had some questions from people who have watched your lecture, and questions we had during your lecture. We stream each lecture live on YouTube for people who don't know, and we have some questions that come in and we don't have time to get to them. One question that came in was, do you think banks will eventually go under if this continues?
Well, no, I don't think that's going to happen, for a simple reason. There's always a need for banks. Not the same banks will not necessarily last, right? So think about Lehman Brothers, established in the 1850s, survived everything, survived the Great Depression, survived the wars, survived everything, didn't survive the financial crisis, right? So a lot of the banks will go under. That happens. But banking as a process of transferring money from one person to another person, shifting that in time. So in other words, short-term deposits transformed in maturity to long-term loans, that business will still exist. So to put that in a different way, the business of banking will survive. Who the people are, who the players are, will be differing, changing over time.
Another question we had that came in was, what is the future of banking, both traditional and within the tech industry? We touched upon this in our conversation, but I think the questioner is talking about 30, 50, 100 years' time. In your opinion, in the research that you've done, where do you see the future of banking?
Well, there are a lot of problems in society that I think that finance can have a role in, but we are not doing it at the moment. The fixation on one part of the economy, which is essentially money, is creating problems, because right now we are beset as a human race with a number of different problems. Right, we have climate change, we have gender problems, we have diversity issues. All these problems are hitting the world simultaneously. But it's impossible, for example, even to raise money to try to go persuade a country in Africa not to cut down its forests or to stop drilling for oil because it would damage the environment. And the countries, for example, Indonesia is spending an enormous amount of money basically mining nickel. Nickel is good because it'll help you for, electric vehicles, batteries, and so on. But it's terrible for the short-term environment because you're cutting down all the rainforests in order to mine under them. So how do you finance these things? Should you finance these things? These are big questions. These are questions of, I guess, existential interest to human beings. Because if you don't solve this climate change problem, we are running into increasing problems day by day. And we sort of are all saying, okay, not my problem, it's somebody else's problem. You deal with that first, not me. And that's a part which I think we should be thinking about in the future of banking. But how do we deal with what we call communal problems, right? And the problem with communal problems is exactly what was called the tragedy of the commons way back in economic stories. That is, if you have a big common land in the center of a village, who's responsible for maintaining it? So questions like, who owns this? What are the property rights? All these questions, we thought we had answered them, but we haven't really. And they're really important today when we try to figure out, okay, how do we deal with societal level problems? Banks are not good at this.
It's the psychology of, it's not my problem, someone else will deal with it. And that ties into climate change in a way.
Exactly.
People
right.
feel as though by recycling, one person recycling, it's not going to do anything.
Exactly.
But you need the collective and the community to do it all together.
Correct.
For it to make a big difference.
And can the finance industry play a role in that?
Can that happen? Yeah.
That is a big question.
It's really interesting. Thank you very much, Raghu, for this conversation. It's been very enlightening, not only for our listeners, but also for me personally. We've realised that following this podcast, I think I'm going to go out there and have a think about where I invest my money and who I trust my money with. We are currently in a hiatus period at Gresham. We stop our lectures in June and we continue in September. We've got a new series in September, which we're having you back for. Is there anything you can tell us about that new series? What's it called and what will you be lecturing on?
That, Richard, is about the big ideas of finance. The thing there is, finance sounds like a very intimidating topic to most people. So, all those numbers, right? People are afraid of numbers. Numbers are really complicated for most people to understand. But the interesting part is most of the ideas in finance can be distilled down to a set of 6 concepts. 5 of those concepts have Nobel Prizes associated with them because they're different ways about thinking about particular types of problems. So in my series of 6 lectures next year, I'm going to talk about one problem in each lecture. Why was this a problem? How did these people try to solve this problem? And why did the originators of the solutions get Nobel Prizes for them? What was so interesting about it? Sort of tying together the entirety of finance into a set of very, very simple ideas.
If you'd like to listen or watch Raghu and any of his lectures that he's given for us at Gresham College, then do go to the website, gresham.at.uk, or you can visit our YouTube channel. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.